Hey everybody, this is Christina Previte and I am joining you live again as I do every Friday for another edition of Divorce Happy Half Hour Live. We are here every Friday right here on Facebook at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time just to give you some quick tidbits and divorce advice in your travels. So happy Friday. Thank you for joining me today. And if you are listening to this on our podcast, welcome. Thank you for listening. Now, today, what I would like to talk about is something that comes up very, very often. We get questions about this all the time, and it's one of the most popular topics on our blogs. And that is what to do with the marital home. Now, specifically, what do you actually do with it when you've decided who's going to get it? If you're both selling it, that's kind of easy. And we can talk about that a little bit. But really, the questions come up when someone's decided that one person's staying in the house, and what do you do with it then? So, the biggest mistake that I see when we get people that come to Netsquire and they have already settled on their own and we're just doing the paperwork is they basically have one party just staying in the house and that's it. Like the other one just leaves. Bye. And that's kind of it. There's no discussion about who's going to stay on the mortgage, for how long, what does that look like, what is the buyout amount. Usually people have agreed to some kind of buyout amount, and I'm going to give you a little bit of guidance on that too. But ideally, if one person is staying in the house, ideally you'd like to see that person refinance the mortgage and the property, obviously, but refinance the mortgage into their name. And what that does is it gets the other party off of the mortgage. So the one that's moving out and leaving. Ideally, you want to keep that clean. If we're just going to use generics here, like let's say wife is staying in the house, husband's leaving. Wife's going to live there. She's going to pay all the bills. It's her house. You really should get the husband off the mortgage, because what happens is when you leave, when the husband leaves, he's still on the mortgage. He still has liability for it. Even if you've agreed that the wife is going to pay the mortgage every month, you still have this liability hanging out there. It still shows up on your credit report. If you ever are in a situation where you want to buy your own house or mortgage something else, or who knows, if there's any number of reasons that you could be applying for credit, that is potentially going to hurt you because you have this large amount of credit out there. So I do get that said, I do get that there are sometimes occasions when, let's say maybe the wife just isn't in a position right now to refinance the house. I know the interest rates are high right now. That's one reason that a lot of people are trying to avoid this transaction. Maybe you could do that for a little while, but if you are going to do that, have some guidance in your agreement about what that looks like. So for how long? How long is the husband going to stay on the mortgage? And also put provisions in there that if the wife for some reason isn't making the mortgage payments, that affects your credit too. You might use a provision like that to trigger selling the house. So your deal is you can stay in the house, it's yours, I'll stay on the mortgage for a while, but you have to be making the payments and keeping everything current. If you don't, then I have the right to force the sale of the house. Because otherwise, if you don't have provisions like that in there, one, potentially you have no recourse. There is no provision saying, well, when does the wife have to list the house? Or, what are the consequences if she doesn't make the mortgage payments? You don't have anything in there. So what would happen is you would be involved in motion practice. You'd have to get the court involved. If you couldn't agree to something, you'd have to get the court involved. And then the court will just have to decide what to do with it. And potentially, the court doesn't have to do anything because you didn't have a provision in your settlement agreement about that. So the court is a court of equity. So they try to do what is fair and equitable to the parties. But at the same time, we are all, you, the judge, everybody is guided by the provisions that are in your settlement agreement. So if you don't have certain provisions in there, there's not really anything for anybody to go by. So that's why you want to address these things. And this is to protect everybody. This is to protect the husband, to protect the wife, because what if the husband says, yeah, you can I'll stay on the mortgage forever until you pay it 30 years from now, 20 years from now, whatever it is. You really should have that kind of language in the agreement, because otherwise you could change your mind and then tell the wife, you know what, I changed my mind. You got to move out. You got to list the property, whatever it is. But she might be thinking, but that's not what we agreed to. I made all of these compromises and I did all these things so that I could stay in the house. And now you're just changing your mind and telling me you don't want to stay on the mortgage. So, those are the things to think about. And I don't say this to encourage anybody to have more conflict, because at Netsquire, we're all about minimizing conflict, but we are about everyone being transparent and upfront and direct. And that's why we bring up these kinds of things to people like you, so that they can have these conversations now before it actually becomes a problem, if it ever becomes a problem, so that you can both be on the same page about what we're doing here, what you both expect, promises that you're making to each other, and have those thoroughly outlined in your agreement. So those are just some things to think about if this is a conversation between you and your spouse right now. But another thing that I want to bring up, because it comes up so often, is that when you have an agreement like this, where one party's staying in the house, and if there's going to be a refinance, you do have to transfer a deed. And usually what will happen is that will happen in the context of a refinance. So if the wife's staying in the house and she refinances, usually you have the title company will handle that, having a deed done where the husband will sign it. And that way he's no longer an owner of the property. So the deed determines the ownership. The mortgage determines with the loan and the promissory note and who actually owes money for paying off the property when you got a loan from the bank. So since we're talking about deeds, I also want to mention that if your house is paid off, there does need to be a deed transfer. So if one party's going to stay in the house and that he or she owns it, the other one does need to convey a deed. And you can often use a title company to do that. They charge maybe a few $100, or you can have a real estate attorney do it. I think they charge something similar, but you really want to have somebody who does this all the time. They know how to record it. They know how to prepare the deed. They know the intricacies of those kinds of transactions, which aren't difficult, but you just want somebody who does that and they know how to do it. You don't want to be somebody's guinea pig. Okay. So those are just a few things to think about if you're having this conversation right now. The other thing that comes up a lot is a buyout amount. How do you come up with a buyout amount? So, a lot of people just pick something out of the air, like, oh yeah, that's 100K sounds good. Let's do that. I mean, hey, if you want to do that and you feel comfortable with that, then do it. But if you are looking for some guidance on how you should be having this conversation, you can do a few things. You can get a realtor that you both trust and have him or her do a comparative market analysis. That's a CMA. And it's not an appraisal. It's just meant to be a guide based upon other similar properties in the area that have sold and what they've sold for. So these days, we know that there are bidding wars, and oftentimes the houses are selling far beyond what they were even listed at. So for that reason, you may want to have an experienced realtor in your area. I think that's important to have someone in your geographic area, because they sort of know the trends in that area and they know what's selling. They can tell you what they listed at, but they could also tell you what have similar properties in the area been actually selling for. And then you can base your fair market value in your settlement discussions on that. So if you decide that, let's decide on a $400,000 value for this house. Well, that seems kind of low these days. Let's say an $800,000 value for the house. If you've got $400,000 left on the mortgage, then you've got $400,000 in equity. So conceivably, if you were splitting that 50-50, each of you would be entitled to $200,000. So that basically means the husband who's leaving the house would be paid $200,000 by the wife for his interest in the property. He's effectively selling his interest to the other spouse. Now, where does that come from? So that's where the refinance comes into play. The wife can refinance the property. She'll need to take some extra on her loan so that she can pay the husband the $200,000 that she would owe him. There are some other creative ways to do that. If you have other assets, like maybe investment properties or investments, or maybe there are retirement assets, could be any number of things, you can do an offset. So you can say, well, I'm going to keep the house. I'm going to just refinance the property with the current mortgage, but I owe you $200,000 from something else. So that means if there's a 401k that wife is supposed to get $500,000 from. I'm doing a lot of math today. I'm not a math person, but these are pretty easy calculations. But if the wife is supposed to get $500,000 from the husband's 401k, then she gets a credit for the $200,000 she owes him, and she'll get $300,000. So there are ways to just do an offset where the money you're owed doesn't necessarily come from the house, it comes from somewhere else. I've seen people also do this with alimony. Sometimes if the wife keeps all of the equity in the house, there will be a waiver of alimony. And I know I'm being so sexist right now, assuming that it is the woman that is getting alimony. Because we have come a long way, but I will say that still, more often it is the female in the relationship that is receiving alimony. And no disrespect to my same-sex couples out there, you know who you are. And in those situations, it's no different. Whoever the person is that is making less money is typically the one that would be receiving alimony. So I'm only referring to he and she just for ease of reference. Okay. So don't get mad at me. All right. So I digress. Going back to what we were talking about. If you need to do the refinance, there are ways to minimize the amount that the person staying in the house actually has to refinance. So that's why mediation can be so helpful if you're engaging in these conversations with your spouse. Sometimes you just don't know what you don't know, right? Like if you've never been through this before, you don't know anyone who's been through this, and maybe you've just had no reason to really explore these topics. It's okay. You're not expected to know how to do this, but that's where Netsquire can come in and help you either with mediation and have this discussion along with you and make these suggestions. Like, we're really guiding you down a path, but we're asking you the right questions at the right times so that you can make sure that you have all of the important information and important topics included in your settlement agreement and in your settlement discussions. So those are really the biggest things I think that people come to us with is what do they do with the house when they've decided who's staying in it? And I just touched on some of those major issues. But there are some other things I would want you to think about if you are agreeing to stay on the mortgage for really a more extended period of time. Is there should be some provision. What happens if the spouse isn't paying the mortgage, or what happens if there's a capital improvement? What happens if there's some major repair that needs to be made? Who's paying for that? Those are things you need to discuss and agree on and have that written in your agreement. You also should discuss estate planning, because as long as you both remain on the deed, whichever one of you passes first, then the other one potentially is inheriting that property because you're both on it. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds with this. I just really want to give you enough information so that you recognize that these are issues that you need to be aware of, that you need to discuss with each other, and potentially need to have maybe a mediator involved. There's my phone again. Sorry about that, guys. Potentially you need to have a mediator involved, or maybe you need to consult with an attorney who does estate planning so that you can find out what happens to the house if, let's say, wife dies and she's living there, she hasn't paid it off, maybe she's been paid in some other way. You really need to just make sure that all of these things are addressed. Don't wait for something terrible to happen and then start asking questions like, well, what do I do now? And the other reason that I point these things out is, for wife who's living in the house, and if the husband is staying on the mortgage, his credit potentially, if his credit isn't good, or if he ends up having judgments against him, those are going to attach to the property. So when the time comes that you want to refinance or you want to sell the house, those judgments will have to be satisfied from the equity in the house. So if it is not your intention that you be responsible for any of that, or you want to make sure that you have safeguards in place so that husband has to pay those judgments and it's not coming out of your share of the equity, you want to just make sure that you have some provisions in your settlement agreement that address those things. Now, going back to alimony, sometimes these things are tied to alimony. I had a case not too long ago where a couple did this sort of thing. And I brought up, well, what happens if the wife lives with somebody? What if, you guys aren't going to stay single forever. I know y'all say you're gonna, but more if you get married and you're going to find love again. I know you will. You always do. And what will happen if your ex-wife's new partner is living in the house? Are you going to feel differently about that? Are you going to feel like you're supporting him too? That could potentially trigger something like, hey, if you remarry or you have a boyfriend and he lives with you in the house, that's when I would want you to refinance. So be upfront about those things. Just be transparent and think about how you might feel if that were to happen. Again, it's actually a lot of things that are tied to the house, but I think those are some of the bigger issues that I see all the time. And some of these things, I don't want them to turn into major conflicts. If you feel like you're making progress and you're doing things more amicably, these are things that would really be better off addressed in your settlement agreement in the finer language. But I do think those are the things you need to talk about: is who's paying all the bills, for how long are you staying on the mortgage, and what happens if certain things happen. For instance, someone's not paying the bills, someone else gets in a relationship, and now there's another person living in the home, if there's a remarriage, and if there's a death. Those are probably the top four that I think you need to think about and talk about as you engage in your settlement discussions. Now, we do have a settlement checklist, which is everything that you could conceivably need to talk about in your settlement discussions. If you want to do that on your own, or maybe you're engaging in mediation and it's just something you'd like to refer to, please feel free to email me at hello@gethappydivorce.com and just ask for the checklist. I will email that to you, and I hope that you will find that to be a helpful resource. If you are interested in learning more about this particular topic and you need a consultation with us, or you just think maybe you're ready for mediation, or you're ready for someone to start drafting your documents and you might be a good fit for Netsquire, give us a call, 732-529-6937. You can always find us on social media. Our handle everywhere is @gethappydivorce, and our website is gethappydivorce.com. Are you seeing a theme here? We want you all to be happy. Get happy. If you need to get divorced to do that, then that is okay. Our mission at Netsquire is to take the stigma out of divorce so that people feel comfortable and give themselves permission to leave unhappy marriages. We were not put on this earth to be miserable. Okay. So that's what I have for you today. I hope that you have a wonderful Friday and a wonderful weekend. And join us again next week, every Friday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you can also catch the replay on our Facebook page or go to the Divorce Happy Hour podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts. We'll see you next time.